Hello everyone, and welcome to a video lecture focusing on Toni Morrison's novel Sula, published in 1973. So one of the first things we recognize about the story of Sula is that it doesn't necessarily start with our named protagonist, but rather with the town itself, a town that she asks us to reconsider in the terms of memory versus history. And so Morrison writes about the black town in which Sula and now live. And I quote, "In that place where they tore the nightshade and blackberry patches from their roots to make room for the Medallion City golf course, there was once a neighborhood. It stood in the hills above the valley town of Medallion, spread all the way to the river. It is called the suburbs now, but when black people lived there, it was called the bottom." The fact that the town is called the bottom, because it is the bottom of heaven, is, as Morrison tells us, a joke. An N-word joke that is all about the origins of the town, going all the way back to slavery. A black slave worked for a white farmer in exchange for land, and the white farmer convinced him that the more difficult land to plow and till up in the mountains was actually the bottom of heaven for God. This is a moment of her poetic prose, providing her own language to invite us into the world of the black folk and add additional meaning, emotion, and imagery to their lives. After we learn about the bottom, we still aren't quite introduced to Sula herself, but rather to the character of Shadrach. Shadrach, a young man who experiences post-traumatic stress after his service in World War I. What's noticeable about black service in World War I is that it was one of the most iconic moments of performing citizenship abroad, even if it wasn't quite experienced at home. In other words, black soldiers were defending democracy and protecting the United States in World War I, even though they may not have full rights at home. Something I encourage you to think further about when we consider how Shadrach is treated or his challenges when he returns after the war. But as we're thinking about his challenges and his experience of PTSD, we also have to really pay attention to that violent scene when he's at the front, running either towards or away from the enemy. He's not quite sure. And as he ran, Morrison writes, "He ran bayonet fixed, deep in the great sweep of men flying across this field. Wincing at the pain in his foot, he turned his head a little to the right and saw the face of a soldier near him fly off. Before he could register the shock, the rest of the soldier's head disappeared under the inverted soup bowl of his helmet. But stubbornly, taking no direction from the brain, the body of the headless soldier ran on, with energy and grace, ignoring altogether the drip and slide of brain tissue down its back." So in this scene, Shadrach is running on the field and immediately sees someone's head blown off. The body keeps running, and then he sees the viscera of the trauma, the wound, all on the field. In this moment, bodies shift and change, become something entirely uncontrollable, and this stays with Shadrach. Later, Shadrach wakes up inside a facility dedicated to helping care for veterans. There, it's noticeable how he prefers things to stay within their restricted zones, particularly even food. The passage reads, "Thus reassured that the white, the red, and the brown would stay where they were, would not explode or burst forth from their restricted zones, he suddenly felt hungry and looked around for his hands. His glance was cautious at first, for he had to be very careful. Anything could be anywhere. Then he noticed 2 lumps beneath the beige blanket on either side of his hips. With extreme care, he lifted one arm and was relieved to find his hand attached to his wrist. He tried the other and found it also, Slowly, he directed one hand towards the cup, and just as he was about to spread his fingers, they began to grow, higgledy-piggledy fashion, like Jack's beanstalk, all over the tray in the bed. Considering the previous scene, where someone's head is gone and the body keeps moving, we can recognize how bodies become out of control as part of his experience of PTSD, but also unruly or uncontrollable bodies is a reoccurring concept or theme that happens throughout the text as well. When Shadrach is released from the hospital, he still struggles with the prospect that bodies can become unruly and that death could be anywhere. These are the effects of having been a soldier in World War I. For as Morrison writes, he knew the smell of death and was terrified of it, for he could not anticipate it. It was not death or dying that frightened him, but the unexpectedness of both. In sorting it all out, he hit the notion that if one day a year were devoted to it, everybody could get it out of the way and the rest of the year could be safe and free. In this manner, he instituted National Suicide Day. On the third day of the new year, he walked through the bottom down Carpenter's Row with a cowbell and a hangman's rope, calling people together, telling them that this was their only chance to kill themselves or each other. So, of course, in reading this, we can understand how morbid it could be and potentially terrifying to have a soldier or former soldier walk down the street shouting, "Today is a day to kill yourself or others." But Morrison invites us into his perspective, understanding that the unexpectedness is what makes it frightening, and he wants to resolve it for himself, but also for others. And perhaps for this reason, the parade that he hosts, that others do actually become part of this holiday. They start to incorporate it into their lives, even if they do not actually plan or even consider his perspective. They do end up recognizing National Suicide Day as a part of their lives and something they can live with. In this way, Morrison shows us how outsiders are a part of their community. And so I invite you to write further about this and consider, how does Toni Morrison, in her writing, show us the ways Shadrach is both an outsider and a part of the community of the bottom? Choose a passage, close read it, to explain how her writing choices, imagery, metaphor, simile, or tone perhaps, these are different literary devices that we might draw upon to recognize her writing choices. How does Morrison show us Shadrach's relationship to the town? And just to expand on things a little bit, I want to provide some definitions of terms that may be familiar to us, but we might need some reminders. The first is imagery. Imagery is language used by poets, novelists, and other writers to create images in the mind for the reader. Imagery often includes figurative or metaphorical language to improve a reader's experience through their senses. Sight, sound, smell, touch, these are all coming together to create imagery. So, for example, the higgledy-piggledy fashion, that gives us a very strong image of how monstrous Shadrach's hands become. Then there's the term simile. Simile is a form of figurative language. It's a literary term where you typically use the word like or as to compare two different things and show a common quality between them. So with the higgledy-piggledy hands, or fingers I should say, this is imagery. But specifically, when we get the phrase, like Jack's beanstalk, again that word like signaling a simile, we also get further understanding or even stronger image of what's happening to Shadrach's hands in his mind. There are other moments in which controlling the body is intended to control or reshape someone's life. In this case, we have Helene, or Helen as she's called by others who prefer to say her name as she prefers, and her daughter Nell. Her daughter was more comfort and purpose than she had ever hoped to find in this life. She rose grandly to the occasion of motherhood, grateful, deep down in her heart, that the child had not inherited the great beauty that was hers, that her skin had dusk in it, that her lashes were substantial but not undignified in their length, and that she had taken the broad flat nose of Wiley, although Helene expected to improve it somewhat, and his generous lips. So with passing, we talked a lot about how there's an idealization of whiteness. In this case, we have a combination of the idealization of certain body parts and what they're associated with. So for example, here, Helene is lighter skinned, has probably more white features because her mother is Creole, and is recognized as being a great beauty. Nell's skin is darker, her nose is broader, and for those reasons, Helene feels as though Nell will be less subject to the attentions of others or being fetishized for being light-skinned. At the same time, even as we note that she is relieved that Nell looks so ordinary, she does take some issue with her nose and gives her a clothespin in the hopes of reshaping it, something that actually would not work. So what's going on in this scene? How do we learn more about Helene and Nell's relationship through Helene's desire for her daughter to look a certain way? Relatedly, we have the scene of poverty and dealing with the body with Eva Peace and her children. Eva's husband leaves, and there's no money for her to feed her children, and it gets to the point where all she has left in the world is a little bit of lard. And so Morrison writes, "Deep in it darkness and freezing stench she squatted down, turned the baby over on her knees, exposed his buttocks, and shoved the last bit of food in the world, besides 3 beads, up his ass. Softening the insertion with a dab of lard, she probed with her middle finger to loosen his bowels. Her finger snagged what felt like a pebble. She pulled it out, and others followed. Plum stopped crying as the hard black stools ricocheted on the frozen ground." This is another moment of Toni Morrison's distinctive writing, being willing to give us all the uncomfortable details of trying to feed your child, but also dealing with the fact that there's no money, there's no food, and he's a bit sick. And so she's doing whatever necessary to relieve his pain, including being able to more or less perform a kind of enema to loosen his bowels so that he'll stop crying. It's also significant that she chooses both elevated language and perhaps more crass imagery to help us understand the stakes of this moment. The last bit of food in the world, which seems very sort of romanticizing and tragic, and then we have the line, "She shoved it up his ass." So the willingness to go between high and low language helps us understand both the highs and lows of this particular moment. There's nothing she's willing to unsay, but also she's willing to present to us another image, another tone, another set of associations, so that we might get closer to the reality that her characters experience. As the scene continues, Eva still has to think about what is she going to do. And now that it was over, Eva squatted there wondering why she had come all the way out there to free his stools, and what she was doing on her haunches with her beloved baby boy, warmed by her body, in almost total darkness, her shins and teeth freezing, her nostrils assailed. She shook her head as though to juggle her brains around, and then said out loud, no. No. So this is one of the tougher moments to interpret or consider in the broader scope of the novel because of its brevity. Essentially here, the thought that is unspeakable, that she will not say, is that maybe her child who she cannot feed, maybe she should kill him. Maybe she should put him out of his suffering. And this foreshadows the events that take place in her other novel, Beloved, where a mother, rather than let her children go back into slavery, kills one of them when slave owners return or come to return them to slavery. So this moment of maternal reckoning, trying to recognize how mothers have control over life and death, is a key theme for Morrison and will emerge elsewhere in the novel as well. And I encourage you to think about that moment of maternal reckoning Do you let your child suffer, or do you save it from the pain, even if it means ending their life? How does this theme emerge in the rest of the novel is something we may consider as we continue reading.